Kenya's mass protests expose African fury, with IMF. Kenya's protests against rising taxes have highlighted deep frustrations, not only with the government, but also with the International Monetary Fund, IMF, as Western instrument of control. Demonstrators in Nairobi made their feelings clear with graffiti that read, "IMF, keep your hands off Kenya." Many protesters blame the IMF for supporting President William Ruto's fiscal policies, which include austerity measures. One young protester, Job Moremi, said, "The IMF is involved in bringing this chaos upon Kenya." The unrest, triggered by a controversial finance bill aimed at raising over $2 billion through taxes, forced Ruto to backtrack on the proposal. However, protests continued, with demonstrators accusing Ruto of being a puppet of the IMF. These protests are part of a broader wave of discontent across Africa, where many countries face pressure from international lenders like the IMF to implement austerity measures. In Nigeria, for example, President Bola Tinubu has implemented painful economic reforms, including cuts to fuel subsidies and the devaluation of the naira, after securing a $2.25 billion World Bank loan. Nigerian labor unions have responded with strikes, echoing the growing anger across the continent toward the IMF and World Bank. The World Bank recently commended the Nigerian government, but many Nigerians perceived this praise as a mockery of the country's harsh living conditions. Adding to the frustration, the World Bank suggested that the government maintain the current economic policies for another 15 years, a recommendation that has sparked widespread concern and disbelief given the ongoing hardships faced by the population. Former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo criticized the IMF and World Bank, arguing that their policies may work for developed nations but are ill-suited for developing economies. He warned that African countries must be the architects of their own destiny, or they risk failure by following the advice of institutions detached from the realities of African nations. The IMF, however, maintains that its role in sub-Saharan Africa is to improve the quality and efficiency of public expenditure, stressing that it tailors advice to each country's specific needs. Supporters argue that the IMF provides low-interest loans, which help countries avoid more expensive borrowing options. But many across Africa, including those in Kenya, see these loans as exacerbating inequality and fueling political instability. Kenya's protests have centered on economic hardships caused by rising taxes on basic goods, such as bread and sanitary pads. In response to mounting pressure, the police crackdown on protests has resulted in at least 39 deaths. The unrest reflects the broader challenge for leaders like Ruto, who must balance the demands of multilateral lenders with the needs of their people. Kenya's public debt, compounded by interest payments consuming 38% of annual revenues, leaves the country vulnerable to austerity measures that could deepen social unrest. Similar scenarios are playing out in other African countries, such as Angola, which is cutting fuel subsidies, and Ethiopia, which is negotiating an IMF loan package. In both cases, the challenges of managing high debt levels and responding to IMF demands could lead to further unrest. In all situations where governments have used unnecessary excessive force against unarmed protesters, Western nations have often refrained from issuing strong condemnations. This contrasts sharply with their swift and vocal criticism when similar events occur in countries like Iran or North Korea, revealing a troubling double standard. Kenya's experience demonstrates the risks of aligning too closely with IMF directives while ignoring domestic pressures. Protesters view the IMF not as a savior, but as a contributor to their suffering, recalling painful memories of structural adjustment programs, SAPs, in the 1980s. These programs, imposed by the IMF in exchange for emergency lending, led to widespread cuts in public services and economic liberalization, leaving a lasting legacy of mistrust. As African nations navigate these economic challenges, the ongoing unrest in Kenya may serve as a warning. Leaders must carefully manage external pressures while addressing the needs of their populations or risk facing similar political turmoil. The IMF insists its goal is to improve the economic outlook of countries like Kenya, but the backlash suggests that many Africans view these efforts with deep skepticism. Despite decades of exposure and criticism regarding the exploitation and subjugation of Africa, many of the continent's leaders continue to rely on harmful financial arrangements and misguided advice from Western institutions. Critics argue that this dependency serves the corrupt interests of these leaders, as decades of borrowing have produced minimal progress. As a result, Africans should focus more of their criticism on their own leaders, rather than solely blaming the well-known external instruments of domination. Join Diaspoint in addressing leadership challenges that hinder Africa's path to progress. We believe in fostering a vision that drives Africa towards sustainable development and genuine transformation. Help amplify Diaspoint's views on real issues by sharing our messages within your network. Together we can make a meaningful impact on Africa's future. Diaspoint, empowered by concerned Africans in diaspora.